James, this year's World Bank IMF meeting is taking place in October in Lima, Peru. Obviously, this has been a year of a lot of fluctuations, especially for emerging markets. What do you think the principal issues on the agenda are going to be with regards to the Middle East?
Well, Adrienne, this is obviously a very tough time for the region as a whole, and particularly for the oil exporting economies. Obviously, the price of oil has fallen a further 26% since May this year, so it's been a steep decline and it's continuing. And obviously for the economies which are built around energy and hydrocarbons, this means that reforms will be needed in the longer term. The GCC region in particular has lost about $380 billion in total export revenues this year. The Saudis are posting obviously a budget deficit. Most of the governments in the region will be in deficit by next year, so huge reforms will be needed, and this will come in the form hopefully of changes to the regime of subsidies they have out there, and obviously in terms of addressing sort of fiscal imbalances in the region as well. More broadly, this will mean sort of a renegotiation of kind of the social contract, so the region will have to try and invest more in the private sector, invest more in job creation to address some of the longer-term structural problems around youth unemployment and those kinds of issues. So there's a lot to discuss, particularly for the Middle East. I know some of these issues are quite similar and sort of tie into the experience of Africa, again, over the last year or so. And so what are the kind of big issues you see around the African context at the IMF meetings this year?
Sure. I mean, this is a particularly interesting time, and it'll be an interesting meeting with regards to the African region, mostly because this will be the first World Bank IMF meeting that's happening after the Sustainable Development Goals will be voted in September during the General Assembly in New York. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals will be the development framework that will guide how DFIs, governments, and the private sector, of course, think about structuring development programs and policy over the next 15 years. The World Bank and IMF and other multilateral financial institutions have played a big role in the new vision for how development is going to work moving forward. And part of that vision involves a much greater role for the private sector. The World Bank and IMF and their other partners at sort of regional development banks, such as the African Development Bank, have expressed a commitment to leveraging their influence and their financial tools to move development finance from billions to trillions. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that in partnership with the private sector. The other big issue, and this is somewhat linked to the whole new development framework, is the issue of infrastructure financing. There's a massive infrastructure financing gap across the region. The African Development Bank estimates that it's somewhere in the region of $95 billion in need per year. So looking with partners, with the private sector, with governments, at how that's going to be filled is a big topic of conversation, and one I expect to come up a lot during the World Bank meetings. And I think the final issue, and this ties very much to issues that you're seeing in the GCC, you're seeing in the Gulf, and you're seeing across the Middle East, is we've seen $2 trillion in commodity prices value wiped off the market just since 2014. There are a few big oil producers, such as Nigeria and Angola, in the African region, but more broadly, the drop in commodity prices across the board are very, very deeply affecting many commodity and raw materials export-dependent economies across Africa. So it is going to be, I think, a moment of reflection and for undertaking very serious thinking around a diversification agenda, one that's been on the books for a long time, but I think now that the consequences of not acting on that are so stark, there will be a reinvigoration of those conversations.
Okay, well, it will be a long road ahead, but I look forward to seeing you in Lima.
You as well.
Thank you.